Okay, good afternoon, everybody, and thank you so much for joining this event where we're discussing racism in the British media. This event is the first in a series of media forums where working journalists, academics, activists, and others debate issues of critical importance to contemporary journalists. My name is Dr. Omega Douglas, and I'm from Goldsmiths College, University of London, where I teach journalism theory and practice, and I do research on media, race, international development discourse, and racism. And I'm chairing today's discussion in the British media. I am joined by, sorry, I can hear myself echoing back. I don't know, maybe if our guests could mute themselves, that'd be great. Thank you very much. So I'm joined today by a really fantastic panel of speakers, each of whom will speak for about 15 minutes in the order that I'm going to introduce them. And then we will take questions from our virtual audience. So those of you who are listening, hopefully, if you would like to ask a question, please could you add it to the comment stream on the platform you're watching on. And please do feel free to add it at any point during the talk. We're going to try and take as many questions as we can in the time that we have at the end of all our panelists' talks. So our panelists are Joseph Harker, who is Deputy Editor and columnist for The Guardian's opinion section. And this week he has begun a newly created role as The Guardian's Senior Editor for Diversity and Development. Joseph has also run the Positive Action Scheme, which supports aspiring ethnic minority journalists, and he's run that since its launch in 2002. Joseph also edited last year's Black History Timeline wall charts. And before joining The Guardian, way back in 1992, Joseph was editor and publisher of the weekly newspaper Black Britain, and he was also an assistant editor at The Voice newspaper. And Joseph is going to be talking to us today, among other things, about the Society of Editors letter, which I'll give a little bit of an introduction to shortly, and the aftermath of that letter. And then Suin Haynes is the editor-in-chief at Galdem, which is an award-winning media company that is committed to sharing the perspectives of people of colour from marginalised genders. And Suin will be talking about the importance of spaces outside the mainstream, like Galdem. And last but definitely not least, Mikdad Versi is the Director for Media Monitoring at the Muslim Council of Britain. And he has spent many years highlighting and challenging Islamophobia in the media. And he'll be talking to us about the work he's done and is doing to tackle this huge problem. So a little bit of an introduction from me. We're really, really excited to have these great panelists with us today. And racism is a long-standing issue within dominant British media organisations, simply because racism is a long-standing issue in Britain. And so today's discussion was partly triggered by the denial that racism is a problem in British media. And that denial occurred when Meghan Markle, the Duchess of Sussex, as I'm sure you all know, highlighted the racist treatment that she's been subjected to by the British press during an interview that she and Prince Harry gave Oprah Winfrey earlier this year. And one of the most interesting factors, I think, that arose in the media storm that followed was not that Meghan had raised this issue, but the huge kind of chasm between the response by the Society of Editors, which is an industry body that acts to protect the interests of British media organisations, and journalists of colour who work for those organisations. And so Ian Murray, the Society's executive director at the time of the April interview, released a statement in response headlined, "UK media not bigoted." And he criticised Meghan and Harry for making comments about the press that are, to quote him, not acceptable, and made without, to quote him, any supporting evidence. So Murray's statement was swiftly knocked back by over 200 journalists of colour who signed an open letter describing the Society's statement as laughable and as an illustration of an industry in denial, and I was one of those signatories. That the Society of Editors saw fit to publish a statement denying racism in the British media is really staggering, given that a quick online search reveals a raft of evidence that demonstrates otherwise, including very recent studies. And further digging would produce more evidence going back years. So, for instance, and Joseph will know about this well, the launch of the Black British newspaper, The Voice, after the 1980s riots in England was largely a response to the under and misrepresentation of Black people in Britain, whilst the 1999 Macpherson inquiry into institutional racism, which led to unprecedented scrutiny of public and private British institutions and their race equality policies following the racist murder of Black British teenager Stephen Lawrence, was a bittersweet period for Black journalists, because like Black Lives Matter today, the inquiry put race on the agenda in the cruelest of ways, and it made Black journalists seen. So those who had long been calling for greater diversity in mainstream UK media spaces used the Macpherson report as an opportunity to urge senior journalists and editors who were kind of busily writing about the institutional racism that the report formally uncovered within the Metropolitan Police to reflect on equality within their own institutions. But decades later, just 0.2% of journalists are Black, compared with 3% of the British population. Asian Britons make up around 7% of the British population, but just 2.5% of the journalist workforce. Only 0.4% of journalists are Muslim, yet make up over 4% of the UK population. Meanwhile, 94% of journalists are white, compared with 87% of the population of England and Wales. And these figures are more alarming, given that most of the UK's national news media organisations are based in London, where, according to the 2011 census, only 45% of the population are of white, English, Scottish, or Welsh heritage. Meanwhile, figures on the likelihood of journalism students being employed as journalists 6 months after graduation indicate that white students have a 26% chance, while Black students only have an 8% chance. And to add insult to injury, research by women in journalism found that no major British newspaper ran a front page story by a Black reporter during a randomly selected week last summer. So this dearth of diversity quite simply amounts to structural racism. So the denial of racism in the British press is clearly wrong, a point that was agreed upon by some senior industry figures, including the editors of The Guardian, the Financial Times, and the Huff Post, who were very quick to object to the Society of Editors statement. Ian Murray has now resigned following the backlash, and the Society issued a new statement saying that Murray's response to Meghan and Harry's interview did not reflect what we all know, that there is a lot of work to be done in the media to improve diversity and inclusion. The Society also, 6 months after the initial complaints from journalists of colour, withdrew its claim that British media is not racist. So why? Given that some powerful people in journalism acknowledge that there is a problem, is the need to improve diversity and inclusion, a kind of ritualistic conversation that's been ongoing for years and only occasionally attracts attention from those in positions of power. There's been ongoing, tireless work by diversity, inclusion, and anti-racist campaigners calling for change within the dominant press and putting forward recommendations and strategies to try and achieve that. So I think a central question for today is, how far have we come and what's yet to, achieve? So I think a really great panelist for us to start with is Joseph Harker. So Joseph, over to you.
Thanks very much for that introduction, and great to be here. It's Goldsmiths is a college I've been to many times. I'm on the panel for the Scott Trust Bursary Award, and I've been to visited Goldsmiths many times to interview brilliant candidates for the journalism course there. So it's good to be back reconnecting. Maybe I should start by saying, clarifying the reason for the letter of outrage that was sent by journalists of colour to the Society of Editors wasn't because Ian Murray had denied that the Harry and Meghan coverage was racist. I think we need to be clear, because that's an argument that we can have. I mean, many people will think it is racist. Personally, in terms of my thoughts on that, I think that the coverage of Harry and Meghan initially was overwhelmingly positive. It was right until the wedding day, it was overwhelmingly positive. She was this sort of beautiful American actress with a little bit of exotic about her. She looked for a black person, she looked very European. She was a kind of very acceptable, and no one really heard her speak. So they felt that she would fit very happily into the royal family and into British high society. I think when things started to change was the day of the wedding, when it struck me, and I'd never been that engaged with it up to that point, but there were three very marked statements about race that she made. She had the black cellist Sheku Kane Mason performed, the gospel choir performed, who were fantastic, and the black American pastor gave his sermon, and at that moment it was like, oh my gosh, Meghan, you really are going to make race an issue here. Up to that point, people had just thought she's this very glamorous woman for whom didn't really think about race. Race meant nothing. And then she went on to edit a Vogue magazine, a special edition of Vogue magazine. It was full of, black and minority people and women and transgender people. And it was, at that point, the press, you felt really started to take against her. Suddenly she was becoming this woke person, promoting all the things that most of the national press detests. And that's when they started to attack her. So I think so when you have an argument about, is the press coverage of Harry and Meghan racist, there are two distinct, eras, periods, pre-wedding, after wedding. And the problem is that you can get into kind of convoluted arguments where both sides can pick lots of examples of negative reporting of Meghan and Harry, and other sides can pick positive examples of Meghan and Harry from different eras or, different writers. But it's a very circular argument that doesn't really go anywhere, and it only ends up entrenching people's already held beliefs. Now, I think what happened with Ian Murray's statement was that it was just a small number of words where he said, the national press certainly is not racist. And that was the thing at which many of us really shuddered and thought, if you are denying that there is any racism in the national press, then there is absolutely no chance of you changing anything. For all your talk about diversity schemes and traineeships and everything else, you really have no interest in changing anything, because at the end of the day, you don't think there's a problem. And that's why this had to be challenged, and why many journalists got so angry about it. We had a meeting at The Guardian of our Black and Asian journalists, and we decided then that we wanted to launch a petition to get people to sign up. It was led by journalists at The Guardian, but we wanted to make sure it went to journalists across the UK. and we got like about 250 signatures in about 24 hours. It was like an amazing response we got, sending out a very clear message that the idea of the press being not racist did just completely went against our own lived experiences of the press. And that's not even, Amiga, you mentioned kind of some of the coverage, and we can talk about negative coverage, and I'm sure we will go on to talk about that, but it's about how we tell our stories. It's about whether the journalists who are in the national press, we can talk about like 6% or 0.4% or whatever, but what matters to me even more than that is what experiences do journalists of colour have in the national press. And you'll find for the most part, we are in the most junior positions. We are on our own in that department, and we feel that many often our ideas are just rejected out of hand because our white middle class editors don't understand our life stories, our experiences, and have no real interest in them. And I think you can probably talk to any journalist of colour in the national press who'll be able to identify exactly with that kind of experience. So to say it was the press is certainly not racist was wrong on so many levels. And you mentioned, I mean, it's just, if you're talking about a typical journalist in the press, you know, why we will go in, we will try and pitch our ideas. We may not, editors for the most part don't know that many people like us. They don't mix with people like us. I mean, it's not as bad as it was when I started in the 1990s. But it's still bad. And I'd say the Guardian has done more work on this than any other newspaper, and we are still, you know, we're not perfect by any means. There's a lot of work to do, hence my new job. But the rest of the press is still sort of back, you know, where it was decades ago. I think it really struck me because I started getting together a group of black journalists in 1999, immediately after the Macpherson inquiry, when it was so obvious that when the Guardian, a liberal newspaper, was accusing the Metropolitan Police of institutional racism, the Guardian itself was clearly a racist institution. It clearly had its own institutional racism issues. And so I then got a group of us together. We then lobbied and got action. That's when the Positive Action Scheme, which I still run, shortly after that it started. But we've done lots of other lobbying, talking to editors about what things that need to change, picking up examples of poor reporting and poor journalism within the Guardian. It's been a long 20-year conversation, and things have changed. But what really I found really disheartening was the response to the Black Lives Matter movement last year, when, among other newspapers, it felt like, at the time, I imagined that all newspapers were having these conversations, all newspapers were taking action back in 1999. But from the response to Black Lives Matter, when these organizations said, oh, yes, we must do something, let's find a black student who we might be able to take in to sort of diversify ourselves, it was clear that nothing had happened in the last 20 years, even though racism and institutional racism has been well known about for all that time. And the kind of small tokenistic efforts that have been made over that period had just shown just how little progress we'd made. I mean, for example, you might find a newspaper will have a diversity traineeship scheme. So someone will come in on say a 6-month contract. The chances are they'll have a pretty miserable time when they're there. They will then not be supported. They'll not be mentored. They'll not be encouraged. They'll just feel completely out of place. They will then, at the end of that internship traineeship, they will then leave because they just find it just not the place for them, not a place they enjoy at all, and they probably won't even get an opportunity to stay. At which point the editors then shrug and said, oh, diversity, we tried that and it didn't work out. And the two things, there's two phrases which kind of really particularly grate with me that I've heard so many times. One is they don't apply. We'd like to do something, but they don't apply. To which point you say, well, what messages are you sending out which makes people feel that your institution is not one that people want to work in a city which is 40% ethnic minority? What is wrong with you in the message you're sending out? And the other one is, which I find even worse, is, well, we don't want to lower standards. And the reason that this particularly bugs me is that when I was in the black press, I spent 5 years, 5 marvelous, fantastic years in the black press, so enjoyable. We had some brilliant journalists come through the black press. Many of them, to my, I didn't like it at the time, but they went on, they left. They were at The Voice or Black Britain, and then they left. But they would always go to the media. They would always go to the broadcast media. They would go to the BBC, which had some black programming then, or to Channel 4. None of them went into the national press, apart from one very well-connected person whose father was an African minister, an African government minister. But there was no, and I could see so many great people coming through. So when I got into the national press, into the Guardian, I thought, we need to do something. There's a whole pool, massive pool of talent that we're missing out on here. And that's in effect why I wanted to start the Positive Action Scheme. I wanted to make sure that the scheme only took on really good people. So we shortlisted and interviewed people to make sure they were the right kind of people who could thrive in the Guardian environment. And then we brought them into the office. And from that moment, editors realized that all these things, questions they had before, were just invalid. They were just myths. You know, there are people, they want to apply, and you're not risking lowering standards. And we've had some brilliant journalists come through that scheme over the last 20 years. Many of whom are at the Guardian, even more of whom have gone on to work successfully at other parts of the media. I would just say, I know time is probably moving on. I don't want to take too long, but you mentioned you mentioned that the Society of Editors had since retracted its statement, and maybe it would be worth just mentioning how long it took them to retract the statement. We wrote the letter back in March when this happened. There was then a kind of period of silence. Eventually, we got to talk to them. I have had about half a dozen separate conversations with individuals from the board of the Society of Editors, including the director, including the chief exec, including a previous director, including other board members. And it again struck me that even though we at the Guardian are used to this conversation, that we know it's a clearly banana statement to make that there's no racism, how difficult they struggled and struggled and struggled. And it was not till August, 5 months later, after numerous meetings, deadlines, eventually the Guardian threatened to withdraw from the Society of Editors unless it retracted its statement. And I met with them representing the Guardian at that point. But it was only based on that. And this is people who think they're liberal, who think they're in touch with modern Britain. But it was just like, well, what kind of message is it going to send out? And we're in an atmosphere now with culture wars, and people obviously don't want to appear woke, or, you know, and there's all this kind of stuff coming into play, which just show, but the fact, and the reason that's important is the fact it took 5 months to retract a statement which was clearly completely wrong, shows just the depth of racism that there is in the British press. The fact that you couldn't just immediately say, we've sacked Ian Murray, he's gone, now we'll take down the statement, now we'll deny all responsibility for the statement. They didn't do that. They kept it on the website for months and months after that. And they just agonized endlessly about how to take it down. And so the fact that agonizing shows just the depths of racism that are embedded in the national press. And that shows how difficult a struggle it will be to try and eradicate it. Although I am forever an optimist, and I have to think that the whole episode has shown that there is reason for hope. The fact they did retract, they did listen in the end, and we have to sort of build on that and hopefully go stronger and spread the word to all parts of the national press. But thank you.
That's great. Thank you so much, Joseph.
Sorry, you're on mute.
Oh,
you're on mute.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Can you hear me now? Yeah, good. I said, that's great. Thank you so much, Joseph. And thank you for finishing bang on time as well. So I didn't need to do a kind of 1 minute countdown. And we'll certainly come back to address some of the points you've made. And I think particularly, you know, the point that you made really strongly about that tiring, agonizing kind of struggle to get them to retract that statement. I thought it was 6 months actually, but 5 months, 6 months, it was months. And that kind of speaks volumes to your experience actually of trying to kind of diversify the industry over not months, but and not years, but actually decades. And you're still working on that. So we can talk about that a bit more later as well. So thank you very much. Okay, so Suin, would you like to go next? And can I just remind people who are listening as well, just, you know, as you're thinking of questions, hopefully you're thinking of lots of questions, please just post them in the chat, and we will come back to them after everyone has presented. Okay, Suin, over to you.
Cool, can you see that? Okay, good. Thanks so much, Joseph. It's really nice to be sharing a panel with you as you are on Gowdam's editorial board, so it's a real treat. So much that really resonate, and kind of the observation of people of colour in national newsrooms being in junior roles and not having so much of a seat at the table and being able to make those decisions. But thanks so much to Goldsmiths for inviting me today. I'm Sian. I'm the relatively new editor-in-chief at Gowdam. I started in July, so not sure how long much longer I can say relatively new. And I'm really glad to be speaking with you all about the importance of independent people of colour run media spaces, how we've built ours, and was also asked to talk a little bit about my experiences as a journalist of East and Southeast Asian heritage in the UK. And you might hear me saying that a lot, so often I just say EC, so that's the abbreviation. But I guess a lot of the things we've kind of touched on that I was going to touch on in my presentation, but I thought it'd be cool to show you some of the headlines and the ways that we at Gowdam have approached some of the big news stories of the last year, and how we're kind of building our space and you know, our approach in the media landscape in the UK. The first, very topical, is the kind of approach that mainstream media took to Meghan Markle's exit and the kind of the discourse around that. And the approach that we took here was kind of, after the Oprah Winfrey interview, we ran this really important analysis by a Black woman on the kind of perspective of how Meghan had been treated in the royal family, which was really important for us to do. This one is a kind of a straight news report on the Sarah Everard visual, and I think our kind of approach here is to push the story forward and think about how we can share ideas that will change things for the future for the better, and kind of thinking about what the news is telling us about the moment we're in and what that means for underrepresented groups. This one, I think, kind of comes back to some of the disingenuous coverage around Black Lives Matter protests last summer, and this kind of two sides are obviously we're really unequivocal in our values and the things that we believe. And then this one was one that got quite a lot of attention, and you know, some of you may have seen. I think this really shows how we're not afraid to take risks and sort of put challenges out there and provide analysis that pushes debates forward. In this instance, the party leader in question actually responded to us publicly and directly and tried to address the arguments that were made in the article. I think that can show the kind of impact that our journalism can have in holding leadership and power to account. So some of you might know, but just a quick sort of intro. Gowdam is a new media company changing the way our industry works. We were founded in 2015 by a group of students in Bristol, representing the voices of people of colour from marginalised communities. Our core editorial output lives on our website, gowdam.com, and I've got it here, I don't know if you can see, but we've just released our annual 5th print edition on the theme of the Roaring Twenties. We publish content daily under 5 different sections: life, arts, politics, music, and comment, or first person. And our role is to be, you know, a leader in the media space, to be ensuring a consistent, trusted source of news and space for our community to meet and connect and share what matters most to them. And here's just a little bit about our sections. I suppose I just also wanted to sort of introduce a bit about myself too, and the stats that were introduced at the beginning. You know, 94% of the journalism industry being white, 55% being male. You know, when I graduated in 2016, it was I'd never thought about journalism as a viable career for me. I'd always had the perception that you needed to know somebody to know someone, or you had to have the means to afford a bunch of unpaid internships, and there's such barriers to entry, especially for people of colour. But I'd seen this advert on Facebook for people to join this new media publication at what the time was voluntary, group called Gowdem, and I struggled to think of anywhere else that was doing the same kind of thing. And now it's really exciting to see that 5 years on, Gowdem has harnessed that energy from the early days, when every participant was a volunteer. In 2019, we became a fully fledged media company, and we employ salaried editors now with commissioning budgets for our contributors. And we have branched into other forms of media, including books and podcasts too. So yeah, just really proud of the progress that we've made. I wanted to share a couple of story examples. You might have seen that we've been working with singer Khalees this week. We've done a guest edit by her, where she's sort of taken over the site. We've done really important investigations, like this one by Moya Lothian McLean, who is also our politics editor, about transphobia in the gender-based violence sector. And then we also ran this one recently about, from the perspective of a young Afghan woman journalist, on the situation that's been unfolding there. I think that's been kind of really important to me, is to see how we've worked with local journalists as well as journalists in the UK. From my experience, I was at Time magazine before coming to Gowdem. I was at Time for 5 years, both in the London and Hong Kong bureaus. And something that I found so sort of endemic to foreign or international reporting was the way in which so many nuances were flattened, and the kind of lack of sensitivity from traditional or mainstream media to covering issues in other countries. I felt that too often people in places were othered, subjected to parachute journalism, and kind of depicted with hackneyed tropes that missed the heart of the story. And I think that is so common, and it's something we've been working so hard to change. So obviously, establishing, running and growing a media company from scratch is not easy. Our founder, Liv Little, and my predecessor, Charlie Brinkhurst-Cuff, and our CEO, Marielle Richards, have worked so hard to get us to where we are now. And a lot of what we've done has been kind of learning by doing and learning along the way. And there have been a lot of challenges, but also a lot of support from mentors like Joseph and colleagues within the industry who have done a lot of work to ensure that a publication like ours can exist and thrive. In March 2020, we launched our membership model, which has helped to generate 20% of our revenue. And I just wanted to share some figures of some of the things that it's enabled us to do. And yeah, it's just really all about sort of bringing the community closer to us and helping that the work we do is sustainable, and that we can keep building it and keep sharing these perspectives that are so important and so overlooked. I also wanted to share, it's crucial that we're not the only publication who's doing this work and championing underrepresented perspectives. Obviously, Joseph, we've been doing it for so long with The Voice and with Black Britain, but I also wanted to share some of the other places that are working, the other outlets that are working in the new media space. A couple in the UK here and a couple in the US as well that I admire. And it's great to see that the landscape is much more colourful now, even when it compared to when we launched in 2015. And I think all of these places are doing really great work, particularly Black Ballad. The way that they're approaching their journalism and their funding, I think it's really important and really great to see. We're also the first byline for many writers, and I think that's something that's always been in our kind of DNA. We're really proud to be working with new talent, and many of these writers have gone on to have successful careers at other publications or really impressive freelance careers. And I think something that's so important to us and our editors is providing a lot of feedback with care on stories, because all of us know what it's been like to have our stories dismissed or been on the receiving end of criticism that was perhaps not as constructive as it could have been. We've also run writers' salons where we've worked with young writers on their pitching, reporting and writing skills, and our open newsrooms workshops, where we're partnering with regional youth organisations to deliver pitching workshops across the UK. And we're just really hoping to share more about what we've learned with more aspiring journalists of colour, especially those who feel discouraged or think that this industry isn't for them, because it is. And I guess just to finish off, to talk briefly about my own experiences, I've definitely felt discouraged or like this industry is not for me at times in my own career. And yeah, just to kind of give a bit of an overview of my experiences as a person of East and Southeast Asian heritage who's mixed race, who's often racialized as white. And that kind of erasure has also been something I've been thinking about a lot. So much about being a journalist of so much about being a journalist of colour who covers race and identity inevitably involves, bringing in parts of yourself to work, and kind of involves, thinking about the ways that news can impact you and tie back to your own lived experiences, and that can take a real toll. And I think, being so mindful of that, I think it's definitely improved over the last year from my experience, but I think there's so much work to do to bring everyone up to that same level of awareness and understanding. For EC communities in the UK, the last year has been really difficult, even though we're a small group, as the statistics mentioned earlier. We're very underrepresented in almost every facet of public life, and the really harmful rise of anti-Asian hate crime, coupled with, and I think in fact partially fueled by sort of irresponsible reporting that associated like visual images of people of EC descent with the coronavirus, just was kind of a double whammy really of difficult and painful things to be covering and monitoring. It was also really impactful for me working in an American newsroom earlier this year, and following what had unfolded in Atlanta in Georgia with the killings of 6 women of Asian descent, and the way that was covered too. It made me think a lot about my own sort of values and the work that I wanted to be doing. And I think for a lot of EC folks and journalists in particular, it has been a trying time. But like Joseph, I'm an optimist. And I think, there has been some good that's come out of it, feeling more connected to communities in the UK and more connected with POC journalists as well. And for me, working in an environment like Galdem, where there's a lot more sensitivity to these issues, has been really rewarding. And I think ultimately being in a space like Galdem has made me feel hopeful that our industry can change despite the setbacks like the Society of Editors letter.
Fantastic. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Yes, good. Brilliant. Thank you so much for such an interesting and really open and honest presentation. That was really great. And you touched on a lot that we'll come back to as well, particularly, your point about lots of young journalists of colour feeling really discouraged. And it's really disheartening to hear that somebody as young as you, and also in the position that you're in, felt so discouraged and really felt that journalism wasn't an industry for you, and you've kind of entered the industry kind of relatively recently as well. So the fact that you're still strongly felt that quite recently is really concerning, but we can come back and talk about that a bit more. Thank you, great presentation. Mikdad, over to you. Oh, yeah.
Thank you very much. Can you see my screen? Great. So thank you very much for inviting me. And the area that I'm focusing a little bit on is Islamophobia in the media and challenging it, and some of the work that I've been involved in. And to sort of start that off, I just want to make sure that there's alignment on what Islamophobia is. And we're talking about racism. Well, Islamophobia is rooted in racism, and there's a type of racism that targets expressions of Muslimness or perceived Muslimness. And so it's just, it's a different way of thinking about things. And that's the definition that the APG and British Muslims advocated for, has got support across different Muslim communities and supported by all political parties. And I want to make sure I put the caveat, other than the Conservative Party, which people might infer what they would like to infer from that. But it's really important to start in that way and recognize that, when you think about racism in a traditional sense, we often think about it in terms of color or ethnic background, but the racialization of different groups, the way that Muslims are treated, in reality is is very similar in many ways, but it's not the blackness which is targeted, but it's their Muslimness or their Muslim identity. And that's really what Islamophobia is. And when you start looking at these social attitudes, and on the one hand, you have social attitudes, you have hate crime, and you have sort of structural issues, all of which, you know, are part of what racism and how racism manifests. When you start looking at what people think about Muslims, it's not really that marginal a view, right? So when you start thinking about 31% of young children thinking that Muslims are taking over England, you know, 56% believe Islam and not fundamentalist groups pose a threat to our way of life. A third, and that's even, I think it's a half of Conservative Party voters, believe in conspiracy theories about Muslims, like these no-go zones exist. You know, and even 18% think that, you know, Muslims have come together to put together a plan to take over the country. And you think, you know, these are not normal views that you would expect, but these racist perceptions of Muslims are very well established and very often have a root within sections of the media. And when you look at some of the academic studies, whether it's the University of Cambridge talking about how mainstream media contributes to what it calls an atmosphere of rising hostility towards Muslims, whether it's the University of Leicester talking about how politicians and media fuel hate crime in Britain. I mean, there's lots out there which demonstrates this, and it shouldn't be something that there's much of a surprise. And you know, when you're thinking about this, one of the big areas that troubles me is that racism also has an impact on the trust that people have with journalism. And if you look at the Ipsos Mori Veracity Index of last year, you see that journalists are basically at the bottom of who people trust, although television news readers are much higher. And you know, there's a problem. You don't want that to be the case. And these figures are probably, and I don't have any evidence to suggest it, but are worse when it comes to minority communities. And so I just wanted to highlight a little bit about some of the work that I have been doing, just to share and you know, recognize that it's not perfect and it's not, and everyone's doing a lot of different work in different spaces, but maybe the journey that I had is perhaps useful about looking at the issue of Islamophobia in the media and acting in some sort of way to try and make an impact. And I group the stuff that I see, that we've been able to see in different categories. And I'll talk about each in turn. But the real big area that we spent, you know, the last couple of years really focusing on is building a strong evidence base. So we have, you know, looked at hundreds and hundreds, no, thousands of articles, and actually that's too little. We've actually analyzed over 100,000 articles, analyzing them against 15 different metrics about how misleading they are, inaccurate they are, and tens of thousands of clips from broadcast to basically understand and paint a picture over a 12-month period about the depth of Islamophobia and the themes that come out. And we had a quarterly report which sort of summarized some of that data, but we've got a big report coming out this year which looks at 2 years ago and looks at that whole evidence base to demonstrate the scale of the issue, in particular when it comes to print media, but to a different extent when it comes to broadcasting. And what I'm going to show here is just certain elements of what we've seen over the last few years, which is that building up of that evidence base. So that people try and say it doesn't exist. It's not our job to prove this to them. But we are doing that anyway. And we want to make sure that there's no concern. And so the fact that there are these inaccuracies about Muslims, that sometimes at some points it was getting to a place where you could see a consistent stream of them, 100+ stories which have had to be corrected related to Islam and Muslims, over the last few years. I mean, it's not small, and then they're not side points. They're not small stories on the side. These are fundamental issues that frame how Muslims are perceived in the public space. And that's how some of these, perceptions that I talked about earlier have come about. 1 in 5 Brit Muslims have sympathy with jihadis. This was corrected on page 2, many months after it came out. And it was massively misleading. I mean, this is the type of nonsense that creates this idea that Muslims, want there to be terrorism on the streets of London, and people want you to talk about that in an explicit way. This one, Powder Cake Paris, I think is a useful one to talk about, because on the right-hand side, you've got the clarification and correction here. It almost feels like it's its own story in terms of how many different errors were made in this one article. If you look at, a feature which said that there are 300,000 illegal immigrants, actually the answer is in that suburb, there were actually only 100,000 people who lived in that suburb. And they said there are 300,000 illegal immigrants in that place. This whole article had a series of issues with it. Now, on the right-hand side are the clarifications and corrections that were 100% provable, that they admitted to. But there were so many other anecdotes in there which were just not true. They said they could not find this author says he could not find a single person in the whole of this area of hundreds of thousands of people who he could shake hands with who was a Muslim, because every Muslim was saying, oh, you're a kafir, I can't shake your hand. He said he wasn't able to speak to a single man or woman who would be willing to shake his hands because he was not a Muslim. It's nonsense. These people, he was saying things that were clearly untrue, and clearly he's not a reliable character when it comes to this specific article, and the fact that he had to be corrected so clearly. I mean, the issue I think that's really powerful here is that other than the fact there's a dozen or so corrections that they've been admitted to, how does something like this pass editorial, the editors? How does this happen? You can't, this is a double spread in a national newspaper. It can't be this wrong. It shouldn't be this wrong, but it is. I mean, you have the Christian child forced into Muslim foster care, 4 front page stories in 1 week, and fundamentally an untrue story, fundamentally untrue. And they had to correct elements of it, but they didn't correct all of it. I mean, it is astonishing how something so outrageously wrong, how outrageously misleading, creating this idea of Muslims as the other is sort of created and developed through time. There's this idea that a volunteer group, mosques have a whole load of things working with young people, and one of them, they have scouts who set up things with scouts, and there was a hatchet job done on Khizra Mosque and a few other mosques, saying that that these volunteer groups were suspended and they were referred to police for extremism concerns. Again, a nonsense article, no justification whatsoever. The head of scouts had to say this was a nonsense story. It was from the Henry Jackson Society, so unsurprisingly, for those who know who the Henry Jackson Society is. And that's the type of nonsense that we end up having to get. And the sourcing is so problematic here. The Mail Online and Express here, nativity scene banned in case it offends one of 4 Muslims living in a Belgian town. Not true. More than 50 million Muslims are willing to support those who carry out terror attacks. Again, nonsense. These are such nonsense. I can't relay how nonsense these articles are, how unjustifiable, how lacking in basic editorial integrity these things are. New £5 notes could be banned by religious groups as banks can't promise their halal. Seriously, there's nothing to do with halal is something you eat. I mean, these guys, other than the fact they don't know what they're talking about, this story was because a Hindu group had an issue because there were certain cow extracts within the notes. Okay, now fair enough, have a story on that. What's that got to do with halal? It's got nothing to do. It's not just, it's illiteracy, it is incompetence, it is trying to play to an audience and to recognize that Muslims are a problem. And I can't emphasize how ridiculous this is. And it's not just the sort of tabloid press. The Times talks about Muslims being silent on terror. And by the way, the author of this article, Fiona Hamilton, didn't write this headline. And I messaged her 5 minutes after this came out saying, what the hell's happening here? And it was clear that she hadn't written that headline, but it's nonsense. If you look at every stat out there, Muslims are not silent on terror, are reporting terrorism like everybody else, but this is how the Times is framing it. And this framing is so problematic. I mean, there are lots of these examples where even things like mainstream faith practices are also attacked in really weird ways. So, for example, the idea that da'wah of the Times, that's Niall Ferguson, so again, perhaps not unexpected, but the Sunday Times talked about how da'wah, which is sort of talking about being your faith and encouraging proselytizing about your faith, which a lot of faiths do, is an Islamist mind poison that turns lost souls into lone wolves. I mean, these are national. I know, you know, I'll come across quite strong on this and maybe too passionate, but it really frustrates me when I see this. And you know, once in Syria, this is the Mirror, and again, you know, you wouldn't necessarily hope to see this in left-wing papers as much, but it does. She dressed her toddler son in ISIS-branded clothing, and taught the youngster to say Allahu Akbar. Why is that relevant? I mean, seriously, Allahu Akbar is what basically every single Muslim in the world will say on a regular basis. Why is this relevant? Because Allahu Akbar is now what every Muslim says is now associated with terrorism, full stop. And you know, this top right-hand example is just one I just want to highlight. Supermarket terror, gunman screaming Allahu Akbar opens fire in a Spanish supermarket. Guess what? It was not a Muslim. It was a separatist from a Basque separatist who did this. He wasn't shouting Allahu Akbar. It wasn't anything to do with it. It was just a nonsense article. A right-wing news outlet in Europe put something out which had no justification. The Sun copied it without thinking, and it was all nonsense. And when they changed it to the fact that it was a gunman, it now no longer was terror. It's now horror, right? Because terrorism is only Muslim related. I mean, it's astonishing how bad these things are. And I could go on with examples about Muslim savages and how Rod Liddell talks about Muslims, but I won't spend too long on that. I think this one here, a cut out and keep guide. Now, the White Widow, Osama bin Laden, and so-called Jihadi John are evil terrorists, fine. But here's what terrorists look like? Really? We want to go down the people who are wearing a headscarf and wear a turban are what terrorists look like? And this, I mean, I don't, this is not side issues. These are really problematic. Nick Ferrari misrepresented Quilliam's figures when in the Express, when talking about child grooming. There's so much out there which is so problematic. And these aren't side things. These embolden the far right. These make them, you know, Tommy Robinson, the English Defence League, Britain First, they use these types of articles from national newspapers to support what they're trying to do. You know, Raheem Kassam was on Radio 4, and he was talking about how there's significant numbers of Muslims who support Sharia, support FGM, and won't report terrorism. Was he challenged? No. Katie Hopkins was brought on BBC Radio Leeds, and she was introduced as the journalist, the pundit, the so-called truth teller, the one-time apprentice candidate. Is that the way to introduce Katie Hopkins? You can make your own judgment as to whether that's appropriate from the BBC. Frank Gaffney, he's one of America's most notorious Islamophobes. That's what he's called by some of the people within America. Okay, he thought that this Operation Defense Shield, this image that we've got here, he thought that was a crescent and a sign of Islam, and how Obama was actually a secret Muslim. I mean, and this is the conspiracy theorist who's out there. And guess what? He was brought on to talk about Muslim-related issues on the Today program and introduced as just a security expert. And it was acknowledged to be an error after a complaint I made. But it's ridiculous. And he was brought on a year later with the same issue happening. And we can't pretend on all of these things there are two sides to an argument. There aren't two sides to some arguments. Racism is wrong, full stop. And the fact that the BBC are recognizing this on climate change to some extent is not the case when it comes to Islamophobia. So what we've been trying to do is, to a little extent where it's possible, try and get some of these things on a reactive basis, we'll come to the proactive side, changed. So UK mosques give cash for terror was a nonsense article, and it was then corrected. And note the size of the correction that's there many weeks later after a lot of work. We've tried to build that evidence base and got hundreds of corrections from national newspapers and trying to put that together. We try and work together with others who are working in a similar way. We've built a team of the Centre for Media Monitoring. We've been engaging with many participants across the BBC, the Mirror, New Statesman, Channel 4, LBC Mail on Sunday, also people from the Sunday Times and others. We've tried to build it to work with press regulators to improve these issues there. And we've tried to widen the impact and work to some extent with social media giants where some of the issues come and make it sustainable. But basically, I just wanted to end there to highlight that the scale of the issue should not be underplayed. The impact of the issue should also not be underplayed on ordinary people and their views on Muslims and what happens as a result. Whether it comes to the narratives that are created about Muslims being supportive of terrorism, whether it's Muslims being related to grooming, whether it's to do with Muslims being apart from us. Many newspapers have played a very problematic role in creating these narratives, and it's important that we need to find what we can to challenge them and proactively deal with them by engaging with them positively, which is something that I've tried in my little way to help with. Thank you.
Thank you so much. You said you've tried in your little way to help with. That doesn't sound like a little way at all. That sounds like it's, you know, huge and extremely time consuming, and, you know, so important, the work that you're doing. So thank you so much for that, and thanks for sharing such, you know, well, for being so passionate about it and sharing all those really great, well, not great, obscene examples with us of the just huge number of inaccuracies in reporting on Muslims and Islam. So we've got some questions that have come in. I've also got a question for all of you. I'm going to kind of start with something that Joseph wrote about, actually, after the Society of Editors' first statement denying racism in the British media. You wrote of going to an event, Joseph, hosted by the Daily Mail on behalf of the Journalism Diversity Fund. I don't know if you remember this particular piece. And the Journalism Diversity Fund supports new journalists from racial minority backgrounds. And you wrote of asking a Daily Mail editor about an overtly racist cartoon that the newspaper had published. And you questioned him about how, on the one hand, they could be supporting the fund, but on the other hand, generating racist content, the kind of content which endless research shows not only negatively contributes to the lived experiences, as you've highlighted, Miqdad, in your talk, of those of us who are misrepresented, but would also probably discourage just a little bit many new journalists from racial minority backgrounds, viewing newspapers like the Mail as places where they would want to work or indeed be welcome. And the editor, you know, shockingly then accused you of being a troublemaker and said that they saw no problem with the cartoon that they'd published. And for me, that kind of blindness to such obvious racism from people who have gone through our education system in this country and now occupy powerful positions speaks to calls to decolonize the curriculum. So sorry, I'm slightly diversing away from journalism, talking about education, but I think you'll see the kind of intersection. And you touched on it, Miqdad, as well, in a statistic that you brought up, which I'm going to highlight too. My feeling is that until a shift happens in our education systems, a permanent shift within dominant media institutions is probably unlikely. And ritualistic conversations that we have about problems around racial diversity and inclusion within white-dominated media will continue to be ritualistic, simply because knowledge and understanding about race and racism being a shared story and one that's integral to all our realities will be seriously lacking. So I'm just interested to know what all your thoughts are really on the importance of education from a really early age, and I'm talking primary school up, being quite central to constructing more diverse and inclusive media landscapes and ensuring that people in positions of power see racism, and of course I include Islamophobia within that as well. And just, you know, to you, Miqdad, you know, the Muslim Council of Britain's March 2021 report on Islamophobia also addresses the importance of helping children and young people understand how Islamophobia manifests. And the report cites the alarming finding that you just highlighted from a study by Show Racism the Red Card that found 31% of young children surveyed agree with the statement that Muslims are taking over England. So it'd be really good if you could speak a little bit more to that as well, and the importance of teaching people at any age, frankly, but particularly kids, so they enter adulthood and the working world with some form of awareness. And then Suin, I think, you know, you're a little bit younger than us. So it would be really great perhaps to draw on your more recent experience of the education system. And if you could just speak a bit maybe about what you feel it's really important for future journalists to be educated on in order for them to actively contribute to more diverse and inclusive media spaces. So I don't know, Joseph, if you have a response to that initially.
Okay. Yeah, I have sort of two thoughts, two critiques of the idea that you set out about whether the importance of education. I mean, one is that it will take a hell of a long time for any kind of change if we're saying that we have to start with the education system, and we have to do a lot more, a lot quicker, and a lot more impactful than just the education system. Because I've seen, even in some of the things that I've heard people talk about in terms of diversity, and people say, oh, we want to get journalists. Well, let's go into schools and try and encourage people to take up journalism and go into sort of the, local inner city schools or whatever. And I say, well, for a start, it will take them at least 5 years to get out of school, to get a qualification, to get into to be even thinking about journalism, and then to then get into our organization, maybe another 5 years, and then another 10 years before that actually be in a position of influence in this organization. I said, if you want to put target your efforts in this organization, rather than going into schools to try and persuade people that some change might happen in 20 years' time. And the other thing I would say as well is that, we see it time and again. I don't think young people are inherently right-wing or bigoted or anything like that. But I would say if they go into an organization, if they leave university and go into an organization like the kind that Mick Dadd has, I won't mention names, but the kind of ones that Mick Dadd has outlined in his brilliant presentation, and fantastic work, Mick Dadd, just to say that's, it's awesome what you do. It's, if only we could clone you and get you, to do look at lots of other inequalities as well, it would be a fantastic thing. But when people go into these organizations, they start to adopt the culture of the organization. And it becomes, in these organizations, they're very hierarchical. The edict comes from the people at the top. If you want to get on, you have to adopt and start to act like the people at the top. And therefore, your way over time, you adopt the kind of culture of the organization. And no matter how you start out, you will end up, if you're in a position to influence that organization, you'll be thinking like that organization. So I think the change has to actually come from the top, which is why the whole Society of Editors matters so much, because that society actually is on its board are people at the top of British journalism. It has to be those kind of people having conversation with those kind of people. When the incident you mentioned with the cartoon at the Daily Mail, I was actually kind of quite shocked, because when I approached him kind of thinking I was going to be a bit mischievous, thinking I thought he'd be quite embarrassed at the idea of this cartoon being in his paper on the same day as he's just been making a speech about the importance of diversity. But he was absolutely the opposite of embarrassed. He was, I was the one, like you say, who was to blame. I was the troublemaker. How dare you come here and talk like that and criticize us? And so it just, as I say, it's deeply embedded, and you have to start at the top with these people, trying to change them, educate them, engage with them in some way, and get them to change, because otherwise you get a culture which perpetuates itself. And even people who are ethnic minorities can go in there adopting the kind of racist, the racist thinking of the organization. In a small way, I've seen how it works at The Guardian, where, there's a dominant liberal, white, middle-class Oxbridge culture, which has been one that when I started was everyone had to sort of adopt that culture to get on. And but in the rest of the press, far more dominance from the top. It's even more prevalent.
Great, thank you very much. And I guess, oh, can you hear me? Am I unmuted now? Yeah, no, thank you very much. That's great. I guess I mean, with an emphasis on education, that not obviously being the only thing, but, had that been in place 20 odd years ago when you started with your campaigning, perhaps we'd be now seeing those kids coming through into journalism with their kind of, more informed perspective. So it's about, the two things going together, educating people in positions of power and going into those institutions, but also doing something about what's going on in our education system as well, so we don't have this constant cycle of, you know, people like us having these conversations on a fairly regular basis. Mikdad, what about your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I think that it's important to play the long game, you know, in terms of the education sector. But I think overall, the driver of media organizations definitely, in my view, comes from the top. If you look at the Express, since Gary Jones took over as the new editor, he basically made a statement saying, I will not have big stories about migrants being X, Y, and Z. I am not going to have my paper was Islamophobic, or I can understand why people saw it was Islamophobic before. It's not going to be anymore. So statements which are quite astonishing to come from, you know, the Daily Express lead. And he came out and said that. Since then, the number of stories that, you know, and we track this stuff, the number of stories from the Express which have been problematic has, you know, it's gone down a lot. Now, I'm not saying I agree with the politics or the Brexit views or any of that. That, you know, but those are political views. Have that perspective, you know, that's fine. I have a problem with racism being a two-sided, oh, we can have this view on it. And the top has been able to change the culture of the organization to do it. It's not perfect. There's still things that have passed by coming from people within the organization, etc. But it made such a big difference when the top was changed and the editor changed in that way. So I think that's really important. I think that, as Joseph said, you know, the more people that are in places of influence and the higher echelons in the decision-making roles, the better it is. I mean, I've spoken to people, Muslims who've been at in editorial meetings, and they said, for example, that they were at meetings where an idea was pitched and they turned around, not wanting to be the Muslim person, by the way, who always talks about Muslim issues, but they looked at it and said, hey, that doesn't sound right. Can you make sure this actually stacks up before you go down this route? And it just was a nonsense piece. It was one of those nonsense things that was cut off quite early, only because he said, can you check it up again? Right? That was the level at which it's, you know, sometimes if you come from a community background, you will know that this doesn't sound right. This doesn't smell right. This doesn't seem to be so. And that was very powerful. So I think that's useful. On the children point, I think, you know, because of our report that you rightly highlighted from the Muslim Council of Britain on Islamophobia that was released last year, or this year, my years are all mixed up. But the value of trying to understand how Islamophobia permeates all levels of society, not just from a media perspective, but more broadly in society. Tackling structural issues requires a multi-pronged approach. It requires us thinking about all the different structures and ways in which these can be tackled. And young people, recognizing, given that 31% of young children between the ages of 10 and 14 in that survey think the Muslims are taking over England, it's clearly the case that there needs to be some education that happens. And people can't get away with this idea, oh, we're only criticizing the faith of Islam, we're not criticizing Muslims. These nonsense discussions and these nonsense veils to try and hide the racism that is embedded within the psyches of some of these individuals when they say these things, when clearly there is a fundamental problem, have to be taken out and challenged at their root. And unfortunately, you know, when it comes to media commentators, Islamophobia just doesn't matter.
Thank you very much. And Suin?
Yeah, I guess just on the children education point, I don't have too much to add, but there is someone that I wanted to shout out that's doing a lot of work in early years anti-racism education, the Black Nursery Manager. She, and I know it's a growing space as well, but the importance of education for early years is vital, and she runs courses not just for the children but for parents as well. And you know, when I told my parents about that, they were like, oh my god, you know, I can't even imagine having a course on how to parent like a mixed race kid like 25 years ago or whatever. But you know, times have changed, and it's cool to see that kind of work being done. On sort of being a young journalist and the experiences of the education system, perhaps more recently, I do think, you know, it's also important to remember that universities can be reproductions of those like hierarchical institutions, and institutions that can feel really oppressive for people of color. And that can be really challenging. That can be really, really challenging to navigate, as well as then thinking about future jobs and future careers, etc. And change from the top down is so important, but doesn't always happen. And so I think, you know, I look back to the experience of Galdem, which was born out of groups at a university, creating a space and creating something for ourselves, for Black folks and people of colour. And I think I look to that and think of kind of the idea of collaboration, of finding your people, of finding mentors that can help, and using those kind of points as starting points as a hopeful route to go down.
Great, thank you very much. And Suin, I know you have to leave us, unfortunately, in a few minutes, so there's a couple of questions on that's okay. Joseph and Mikdad, there's a few other questions, so if you're able to stay a bit longer, that'd be great. But I just wanted to get in a couple of other questions for you, Suin, from the chat. So someone has asked whether that, you know, Galdem obviously is a publication for underrepresented communities, and if by that you mean underrepresented communities only in the UK, or if that extends to people around the globe, because this is somebody who's from India and is really interested in writing for Galdem.
Yes, pitch us. We're around the globe. We've had several stories from India, actually, from writers in India over the last couple of months. Yeah, I think when we first started, we were definitely focused on UK audience and UK writers. And I think, you know, the majority of our readership is in the UK, but we certainly work with freelancers and writers from all different parts of the world, and have been so proud to publish, you know, several stories from India. We published a really nice photo essay on maternal health in a really remote region. And then there's a story that I mentioned in the presentation by a young Afghan woman journalist as well. Yeah, so pitch us. The form is on our website.
Great, thank you. And there's another question for you and Mikdad as well, actually, which says, you both talked about the real world harm done by racist reporting. Do we need better regulation, boycotts, something else? So Ian, do you want to tackle that first?
More clones of Mikdad. No, that's not a sustainable solution. But I think, you know, I think education definitely comes into it. And I think it's really interesting, Mikdad, to hear you talking about feeding into the IPSO code and things. You know, it's such a huge part of the last year was for Britain's East and Southeast Asian Network, which is the kind of organisation dedicated to our communities, was lobbying, you know, outlets to stop using images like stock imagery of people of EC descent in articles about coronavirus. You know, there would be articles that were about coronavirus, like when it first came to the UK, and it would be like images of people in the EC region, and that's really harmful and perpetrates that kind of stereotype and that instant like visual association. I do think, and you know, there have been some retractions after dedicated people have written in and asked for corrections and complained, but we can't rely on that all the time. You know, we can't rely on that all the time, that it's consumed so much energy. And I think there has to be better, you know, sense check and better education among editors as well, and maybe regulation is the way to implement that. I'm sure Mikdad can say thoughts much more eloquently than I can on that.
Go for it, Mikdad.
Thanks, Ian. I think that, you know, responding and reactivity it has to be part of the solution, but it can't be the solution. And in terms of what we can do, stronger regulation is part of it. I think that, you know, when you look at editors' code across the world, because we have to obviously retain certain elements, you know, we want a free media. We want to make sure we have that freedom in our society, because it's a fundamental part of how we grow. But how can you balance that with the rights of all communities? When you look at other codes across the world, they've got clauses on there to protect groups. And the Leveson inquiry had specifically requested, I think Section 28, if I'm not mistaken, but there was a specific clause which said, you know, in clause 12 of IPSO's code, it should have protection against groups facing abuse. And they were quite, you know, we can learn from other countries if we find it difficult to do it. These are countries who are higher than the UK in the Free Media Index. So let's not pretend that that by better regulation on the way that racism manifests, that would cause a problem. Ipso, I mean, I work with Ipso trying to improve the code. I engage with it. Doesn't mean I think it's a perfect body. I mean, they've had people on their front, who are in charge of appointments within Ipso, who themselves have published really problematic articles, who actually attacked authors who complained to Ipso. I mean, these are fundamentally awful things. And that person wasn't sacked, right? He left, he happened to leave, but he wasn't sacked when he did that. So it's Trevor Kavanagh, this is public information. So you have flaws in a body which has not, theoretically is stronger than the PCC, the Press Complaints Commission, which was there before. And one of the reasons it's stronger is because it's allowed to investigate standards breaches, as in look at a newspaper which consistently breaches its standards and actually put a fine on that. Do you think they have used that power in the last 5 or so years? No, they haven't. So let's be clear. Have they even looked into racism within the press, as a regulator might seem they should do? They were very strongly encouraged at the Home Affairs Select Committee. I've been speaking to them about it for about 5 years to encourage them to do so. And they use the Home Affairs Select Committee as a reason not to do it, because they have to wait until the Home Affairs Select Committee comes back to them with the report saying what should happen, because they had basically promised that they were going to do it and they never did. So, and now the Home Affairs Select Committee hasn't released a report at all, so nothing's happening. So, when you look at all of these things, there are real structural problems in the way the regulations work. Is that the only answer again? No, I don't think so. So I think reactivity is useful, but not the answer. I think regulation is useful, but not the answer. I think I go back to what Joseph was talking about. It's about the journalists within these newspapers and from the top, people in influential positions, people in the top board, where editorial board, where decisions are made, them making the decisions. They want to change the culture of what happens, them taking a no tolerance policy on these things, them recognizing that we're not going to platform people who clearly have racist views, who publish racism and only apologize afterwards. It needs cultural change from these institutions. And then, all the stuff on the side, like reactivity in terms of complaints, like regulation, like social media sharing, which I think also is an important element in terms of that being able to improve. And I can talk about that if useful. Those are all side points. The big thing of a media is the people who make the decisions, and they need to get better. There needs to be support. That needs to change fundamentally.
Great, thank you very much. If you're happy to stay with us, Joseph and Mikdad, until 6, just so we can get through the other questions, Suin, we will thank you so much for your fantastic presentation. And sorry you have to leave us, but completely understand you're under pressure to get to another meeting. So thanks so much, and virtual round of applause for you, and thanks for all the great work you're doing.
Thank you so much, and sorry I have to leave as well. Thank you so much for the great conversation. Bye, take care.
Bye. Bye. Great. Okay, thank you. So, Joseph, a question for you. You have started a brand new job this week, but in the same organisation you've been working for I think almost 3 decades or something, all kind of coming up for 3 decades. So the question is, could you say a bit more about your new job, and does this represent a move away from diversity, quote unquote, which puts all the responsibility on the very few people of colour on staff, and towards better reporting by all journalists? And if so, what's the plan? How are you going to do this?
Well, first, just on that previous question, and I think the way Mikdad left it about it needing to come from on high, I wouldn't want any student journalist to be disaffected or feel that they will have a miserable time in the national press. Obviously, I came to the national press 30 years ago. The national press still has problems, but what I found is what has really been empowering for me in all of those 3 decades, or certainly last 2 of them, has been, around the time of Macpherson, I just sort of gathered a group together of all the sort of Black and Asian journalists who were at The Guardian at the time, and there were about 10 of us. And we together put a statement out in our own voice saying, we are not happy with the way The Guardian is, the way the Guardian looks at race, with the way the Guardian treats its minority staff and the opportunities, and a whole list of criticisms. But we had real power because even though there were very few of us, we spoke with a united voice. And the editor then could not say, he could have picked off Joseph, or he could have picked off someone else, or someone else over there on an individual basis, but he couldn't ignore something that came from all people of colour at the Guardian. And however small a number of us there were, and again, that's why the letter we did to the Society of Editors was so powerful, because it was people of colour uniting together to speak in one voice. And so if all I would urge people in these organizations, where it seems that change is so slow to happen, everything is so resistant to change. At the top of all these organizations are people who think they're in touch with modern Britain. They think they understand the world as it is. They hate the idea of being called racist or bigoted or anything else like that, because they couldn't possibly be like that. And if you unite and raise the issues that, from your perspective, as you see it, in a number of you, they'll pick you off if there's just one of you, but if you group together, you can really stir a change, prick their consciences and stir some action. And if you keep pursuing it and keep making that point, you can over time change. And I think that's what's really felt different at the Guardian to other newspapers, in that for 20 years, we've been having these conversations and pushing these agendas. I don't think these conversations have been had at other newspapers, but I would urge any student, if you go into a national newspaper or national media organization, look for the other people of color around and encourage an organization that will lobby on your behalf for change. Now, I can't remember what was the question.
That's great, thank you. And I'd add to that as well and say, if you do happen to be the lone person of colour within an institution, there are lots of great kind of networks and organisations where you can meet other journalists of colour who work for other organisations. So the power, that the Society of the letter that you guys put together at the Guardian about the Society of Editors statement was not just journalists at the Guardian, but the power of it came from the fact that you reached out, and it was journalists all over the country who were signatories to that. So if you do feel like you're alone in an institution, look for allies and connections outside that institution, and work with other journalists elsewhere to try and affect change within your organisation as well. That's
I just remembered now, the question was about my job, wasn't it?
It was about your job, yeah.
So I've been doing a lot of this work in my own time for the last 20 years, arranging the work placement scheme, having meetings, lobbying for change. And so what I see this new role as, and it was created following the Black Lives Matter protests of last year, the Guardian responded with a lot of cajoling with a race equality plan, a race action plan, and this role was created as part of that. So what I see it does is it gives me more seniority and more time, more resource to try and take this agenda. I work on the opinions section at the moment, but this allows me to make much more fundamental changes across the whole organization. And the questioner is absolutely right. It can't just be left to me or even to people of color at the Guardian, who in whatever positions they are, to make the change. It has to be the other 80% of white journalists have to be with the agenda as well. And I've been having meetings already with some of the senior leaders at the Guardian. I think a lot of the problems and the difficulties now are people actually want to change, but they're not sure exactly how to, or they don't have the time, or it's not today's priority because we've got a daily newspaper to bring out. And I see my role to sort of assist them, to advise, to enable them to make the changes that they want to make. And I see it far more of a collegiate thing that I can be helping them. I've had the first 10 years after Macpherson was basically me arguing with senior editors about why we need to change. And we're beyond, thank God we're now beyond that. And I think people recognize we need to change. It's just how we go about doing it.
Great, thank you very much. And I'm just conscious of time. So Mikdad, I'm going to go to a question for you, which is, Islamophobia is clearly a real problem in the media, as you brilliantly kind of spelled out for us. But do you think this is exacerbated by religious illiteracy? Should religious literacy be taught in journalism schools?
A really important question. I think that there needs to be a recognition in journalism schools of the errors that happen within journalism right now, and the fact that Islamophobia is such a big problem and religious literacy is such a big problem within this space clearly means that the better religious literacy means the journalist has, the better a journalist they are. I mean, I think the big thing here is, how can we ensure that journalists are better and better equipped to deal with these things? And some of it is about providing some of that, support. We're putting out a case of any types of words that you might want to use when it comes to Islam and Muslims, and understanding the pros and cons of using different types of words. So we're going to be putting something out there in terms of guide. We're going to be putting, Muslims and how to talk about Islam and Muslims and terrorism. We're putting a lot of resources to help them, and we're actually speaking on it at many journalism schools. I believe Goldsmiths is one of them, if I'm not mistaken. Rizwan Hamida, our Centre for Media Monitoring exec director who's in charge, she's speaking, and she's sort of building together modules or lectures to try and cover the specific area about Muslimness, and how reporting about Muslims needs to be done in a better way, and some of it is actually just applying some of the principles that are there within journalism to a slightly different context and understanding how that works. And some of it is due to mass misunderstanding that, on topics that you don't know anything about, it's easier to make mistakes, and you need to be more careful about it. I just wanted to add, so I think that sort of kind of answers the question. I just want to add one final point. I think I've come across quite negatively, and I need to change that slightly. I want to be a bit optimistic as well. Joseph is right here. Change can happen. It does happen. And we have seen how it has happened. The number of journalists from BAME backgrounds has gone up significantly. The voices of BAME communities are stronger in many ways than they were, a decade ago, 2 decades ago, etc. The trajectory is a positive one. I mean, if you look at what I've seen on reporting on Islam and Muslims, maybe correlated, and we don't know if about the causation, but in the last 5 years, there have been fewer really awful stories about Islam and Muslims now than there were 5 years ago. Don't know. We can't talk. I can't prove any link. I don't need to. I can't say that. What I can say is that people that Trevor Kavanagh in The Sun said, I now have to walk on eggshells because of the eagle-eyed Mikdad Versi. Good. Walk on eggshells. Be careful. Read your stuff. Check your accuracy. Get your figures right, and then you won't have a problem from me or from anyone else. And I think that this is the problem. If they know that they're being watched, hopefully that will play at least a small role in making it better. So I want to be optimistic. We can make a change. We have made changes, and people are the way in which change can happen. And I encourage people to get involved in media where they can, build networks, join groups, work together, be united as much as possible, recognizing you should always have, diversity of opinion is not a bad thing. And then together we can actually make a difference. And I've seen that, and Joseph's work in particular has been fantastic in this.
Brilliant, thank you, really inspiring stuff. And I think that also partly answers a question from Jasjeet Singh, who said, brilliant stuff, Mikdad. What sorts of responses have you had about your work from the industry? And it sounds like you are getting responses slowly sometimes, but change is happening.
Yeah. Change. Some places, just one line on this, some are more responsive than others. So actually the Sun Online and the Daily Mail actually have engaged, and there's been some really positive stuff happening. I've seen these explainers that sometimes come, these blue boxes in the Mail and the Sun, just to explain certain things. They're doing that stuff which they weren't doing a few years ago, you know, that context is really valuable. So
yeah, and there's a really interesting study in itself, just looking at those explainers and those apologies. I'm going to try and squeeze in our last 2 minutes just a couple more questions. So one from Sophie Don: I'd like to ask generally what a white journalism student can do to avoid being labelled a white saviour, to help promote, when they're trying to help promote equality and report on injustices. Thank you so much. And another one from Mio Matsui. This is a very basic question, but I would like to ask why racist coverage has been produced. Are individual journalists who wrote and edited bigoted? I don't know, Joseph, if maybe you'd like to begin to respond to those two questions.
Maybe the first question about the white saviour, all I would just say is listen, don't lead. Let us do the leading. It's our issue, it's our struggle. But if you listen to us and hear what we're saying, then that's the best place, the best possible place to start. And in terms of what was it, the change, how to...
I'm just scrolling back up, and so yeah, how can you kind of as a white journalist be writing about, you know, racial injustice, for example, without being labelled as a white saviour? And you've just answered that. And then the other one was, this is a very basic question, but I would like to ask why racist coverage has been produced. Are individual journalists who wrote and edited bigoted?
I think it's a sort of cult, like as McPherson talked about institutional racism, where it's sort of things from the top. There's a kind of group thing. Often people will come out with a stereotype. It's never challenged, as Mick said earlier, and it just gets in, it just gets published, and it goes down a line. And some of the things I've found really bad are thinking it's not only the writer, it's gone through a sub-editor, it's gone through an editor, and none of these people have actually challenged this kind of basic premise, which any person of colour would see was ludicrous from the start. But it's sort of a succession of small things which kind of make the end product.
Brilliant, thank you very much. It is 6 o'clock, so can we just do another question to you, Mick? We're not going to have time, I don't think, to get through all our questions, but there is one specifically for you, Mick, from Hadia Bakr, where she has asked, where do you see the future of your work heading, and how do you see Muslim journalists changing the type of stories that are often told about our communities?
In terms of the work that's happening, you know, we have a Centre for Media Monitoring now with 2 or 3 people who are building that evidence base even further, but really actually pivoting from that once that sort of, you know, ends in the next 6 months, pivoting really to trying to support journalists as much as possible. You know, we don't want to always be the bad guy. Not necessarily that that's a bad thing, because it's important to challenge and be there. We also want to be supportive and help and you know, frame things in a way that can really be supportive. You know, there is a problem in this type of reporting. Here is how to resolve it. Like, just try our best to work in that. We're also going, you know, speaking to universities for journalism students, engaging and making sure that some of these topics and evidence base can be informed and people can understand. You know, we've got a full report on how Muslims are reported when it comes to terrorism. You know, there's 200 pages there. If some of these elements can just be understood and internalized, hopefully that can play a role. You know, we have roundtables with media editors and senior people in the industry to try and, you know, work on these areas of issue. This won't resolve people who want to be evil, who want to be Islamophobic, but hopefully this might be able to support at least those who maybe unintentionally are being racist, and we need to work as much as possible to tackle that and move things forward in that way.
Fantastic, thank you so much. There are some other questions, but I'm afraid we have gone over time. So thank you for your really inspiring and really informative talks. A huge thanks to both of you, and to Suan, who's already left us. And thank you to our audience as well for joining us today and for being part of this really, really important, long-running and ongoing conversation. We have another media forum tomorrow at the same time on international reporting. So those of you who are listening, and Mick and Joseph, you're also welcome to come along to that and listen and ask questions if you'd like to. Please sign up for that and join us for that tomorrow. But thank you so much again, Joseph and Mick, and thanks for all the amazing work that you're both doing. Thank you very much. Goodbye. Take care.